So thank you so much for the very kind introduction and specifically for the opportunity to join you here today. It's really great to be here, especially I feel quite sort of special that I'm able to share what's essentially a very personal story that I've gone through in combining my professional life and in my personal life. So some of you may have guessed from my name, Elin Haf. I'm Welsh, I'm from North Wales, and I grew up on a farm. I was the youngest of four. I thought I had the making of a great farmer. But growing up in what was essentially a very traditional and loving background, it meant that my brothers always got to go outside and do the farming, and my sister and I had to stay indoor and do the cooking. I was never any good at cooking, and so I decided to leave Wales and move down to London to start on my professional career as a children's nurse. And I joined Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. And becoming a children's nurse was by far the best personal and indeed professional decision that I ever made. And my days in that uniform at Great Ormond Street Hospital has certainly kind of been the foundation to everything that I've since then gone on to do. But I guess that living in London was great and I was enjoying the city life buzz. That overwhelming desire to roll around in the mud prevailed, and I decided to start playing rugby. For those of you not familiar with rugby, it's sort of considered to be quite a physical, aggressive game. There's a lot of rolling around in the mud. But the thing I really love about rugby is that it doesn't matter what size or shape you are. There is a position for you in the team. And I think it sort of reflects life itself, really, that it doesn't matter what size or shape you are. You have a valuable contribution that you can kind of give to the team dynamic. On a personal level, I was a prop forward, which means that I was the big fat one in the front row doing all the scrimmaging. So even if I didn't necessarily look like an athlete, just by applying a little bit of deep heat, I could smell like an athlete. For 13 years, I combined playing rugby and working as a nurse. I was very fortunate to be selected for the Welsh student squad, then the Welsh senior squad, and I was delighted to have 13 A international caps. I never got that full cap, which means I was on the bench for a few of the Six Nations, and I was the non-travelling reserve for the World Cup, which you have to understand is the most pointless position that there ever is. And you constantly feel guilty because you're praying for your teammates to get injured, which never feels like a right sentiment to have. I was eventually dropped from the Welsh rugby squad, and I never got that full cap. And it also coincided with me going through a divorce. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford therapy, so instead I decided I would row across the Atlantic. I'd never rowed before, I'd never been out to sea before, and I certainly didn't have the £63,000 that it would take to fund the campaign. But when they say never underestimate a woman on a mission, it was particularly true for me in the 2 years that it took to put the campaign together. And after 2 years of extensive planning, I found myself in a 24-foot marine plywood boat, setting off to sea, racing against 21 other boats. I should have explained that I decided that it would be completely crazy to do this alone, and the first thing I did was to persuade my fellow nurse and colleague, Herdip Sidhu from Great Ormond Street Hospital, and we launched the Nautical Nurses campaign. My parents came to the tiny island of La Gomera to wave me off, and as we pushed the boat off the harbour wall and waved goodbye at them, I can genuinely see in their faces that they thought they were never going to see me alive again. And it has to be said that if I'd have known what I was setting myself up for, I would have never, ever started. The rota was that we would row for 2 hours, sleep for 2 hours, so alternating. So we always needed one of us to row the boat to keep the momentum of the boat going. So it's 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours off. And I have to say that it became very quickly apparent that the pain in our backsides would be really something quite unbearable. I've decided not to share a photo of my naked bottom with blisters on it, but please believe me when I say that that seat is genuinely still imprinted on my backside till this day. But it wasn't just my bum that hurt. There was the constant pain in my hands. Because every rogue wave would come and try and rip the oars out of our hands, we had to hold onto the oars really tightly, which means that our hands adopted what we call this claw-shaped position. So even when we were rowing, we couldn't actually straighten them. And when we did straighten our fingers, we'd get shooting pains down our arms. And if we were unlucky that a rogue wave ripped the oars out of our hands, it would mean that the boat would then land at a funny angle, and all the weight of the boat would transfer through that oar and smash us on our shins. And I don't know if you can see my bruises on my shin, but inevitably in a 2-hour period, the oar would smash on the exact same spot on your shin, just bringing tears to your eyes, and would often just make me wish I'd so packed my shin pads from my rugby days for the journey. But it wasn't actually the physical part of the challenge that was the hardest. It was the emotional and the psychological part. And that was very much compounded by the sleep deprivation of the 2 hours on, 2 hours off that we were doing. So this is our sleeping quarters. As you can see, it's sort of not big enough to stand up in, to sit up in. It's more like a coffin, really, that we would crawl to sleep in. But every wave that would slam against the hull would sound like a steam train crashing into us, and we'd get knocked backwards and forwards. So even though we had 2 hours off, by the time you'd eaten, checked the GPS to make sure that we were roughly going in the same direction, gone to the toilet, which if any of you are thinking, yes, it's a bucket and chuck it kind of approach, there wasn't actually a full 2 hours that you could sleep. And from the sleep deprivations, the hallucinations started, compounded by the fact that we were popping painkillers like they were going out of business. It meant that we saw everything out there at the ocean, from soldiers to snakes to you name it. It was on our boat, and we will fight that it was. We made it to Christmas Day, which marked that we'd been out at sea for 3 weeks at that point. Sadly, Father Christmas didn't find us out there on the ocean wave, but a sailing yacht kind of randomly going past did. And while on the one hand, it was great to see somebody else and have a quick hello conversation with somebody else, it didn't really cheer us up that much, because they were sipping cold beer on a luxurious yacht, while we were sort of very much relying on our desalinated water and the one luxury treat that we'd packed, which was a Marks and Spencer's mini Christmas cake. I got to eat all the marzipan, and Herdip got to eat all the icing, and we thought that Christmas Day really rocked. We did also have a satellite phone call with my Radio Wales, and what was an amazing thing, they'd planned for all my nieces and nephews to sing a Christmas carol for me on the radio, at which point I just burst out into tears. Thankfully, the signal on the satellite phone cut off, and all of Wales didn't have to listen to me cry on Christmas Day. As the days rolled into the weeks and weeks rolled into months, I actually realized that I loved life at sea. From the rainbows, the sunsets, the sunrises, all the different shades of blue that I saw. And since I returned, many people have said to me, well, you're not lonely out there on the ocean, hundreds and thousands of miles away from people. But I think it's really fair to sort of say I became to truly understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. And we were getting so many messages of support via our satellite phone from people that we'd never met, who were just sort of saying, you know, we're really behind you. And it was like a comfort blanket that cheered us on and made us feel that, you know, really this was possible. And there was chocolate. We had packed 4 chocolate bars each a day, and I defy any woman that can't be happy when she gets entitled to eat that many chocolate a day. And it certainly made up for the freeze-dried food that we had for the rest of it. So I don't know if you can see in the pack there, it's a sort of army rationed food. So we use the desalinator to convert the seawater into drinking water. We'd boil it, we'd rehydrate the food, let it stir for a few minutes, and then eat it. It looks absolutely ghastly, but by about day 7, it's quite edible. The only problem that we had was we'd packed 2 sporks, which are the sort of combination of fork and spoon that you may be familiar with. And we were so convinced about weight saving, we thought just 2 will be enough. Sadly, 1 had snapped within the first week, so we just had 1 between us. And we were so exhausted, we didn't even have the energy to wash it. So after 1 had finished it, you'd lick it clean and pass it to the other one to start eating. Which wasn't so much of a problem for me, but Herdip was a vegetarian, so whenever I'd eaten spaghetti bowl, she'd get really upset if I hadn't licked the spork clean enough. Every Sunday, I'd jump off the boat. It was more to look for Finding Nemo, afraid, not to really look for your kind of Neo. And I would take a scraper with me, and I would scrape the bottom of the hull to get rid of the barnacles. Because we were rowing so slowly and the barnacles were growing quite rapidly, the concern was that it would slow us down. So I'd be scraping the barnacles and watching it drop down into the depth of the ocean. Some little fish would come and nibble on it, and then some big fish would follow. And then the theme tune of Jaws would echo in the back of my mind. And I'd sort of panic and quickly jump back on board. I'm pleased to say I didn't see a shark while I was in the water, but it was always a kind of awareness that they probably weren't too far away. One of the visitors that we did have were the dolphins, and I am adamant that the dolphins always visited at the times that we felt our lowest, at the time that we really felt that we could not row another stroke, let alone another day. Pods of dolphins would come and visit us, 15, 20, 30 dolphins at a time, and they'd spend 15, 20 minutes sort of dancing and performing around us, just truly lifting our spirits. And the emotional impact of that would mean that we'd swing from hating it to loving it in about a nanosecond. And it somehow felt quite spiritual that somebody was being sent to cheer us up. I do have a confession about this photo that, yes, I did take it, but it wasn't actually on that Atlantic row. It was when I came back to Wales and went for a sailing trip on a day trip after, which kind of made me think that maybe we can go all the way around the world looking for something and finding it on our doorstep in the end. Other visitors that we would have, which we weren't so pleased to see, were the cargo ships. So we were crossing quite a few shipping lines. And as I mentioned, we were rowing very slowly at sort of 2 knots. And these cargo ships travel essentially at sort of 18, 20 knots. So from the point of seeing them on the horizon to a potential risk of collision, you've got about 8 to 12 minutes to ask them to divert their course. So we'd get on our handheld VHF radio, we'll say, big ship, this is a little rowing boat, can you divert your course, please? And there'd be prolonged silence, and then you'd sort of start panicking, or maybe they're on autopilot, maybe nobody's on watch. And then you try again, big ship, this is a little rowing boat, can you divert your course, please? And then eventually you'd get a voice over the radio and says, no, it's fine, we can't see you. And it's like, well, it's because you can't see us that it's really a problem now. And even the afterwash that these cargo ships cause are actually much higher than what the depth of our rowing boats are. I'm pleased to say we obviously didn't get into a collision, but on quite a few occasions after the cargo ships had diverted their course, we would get a message on the radio a few minutes later and say, just to check, do you guys want to be rescued or are you there by choice? And it was a difficult one to explain. No, we were there by choice. The trip ended up taking far longer than we'd expected. And everything on the boat, including ourselves, started to fall apart. Being good nurses, if we could fix it with duct tape, it meant that we could carry on. But if duct tape couldn't fix it, we had to go without. Eventually, we saw a tiny dot on the horizon, which marked Antigua and the end of our journey. Unfortunately, because the journey had taken far longer than we'd sort of anticipated, my friends who had been patiently waiting out there for me had said, Elin, we can't wait anymore, we've got to go back home to work. And my parents had been constantly stressing about when to book the flights, we're going, we're not going. So by the time we realized we were definitely going to be landing on a specific day, they said, we can't find flights, we're not going to be there. And so I persuaded Herdip, who had hated every single moment of it so far, that we should drift around for 3 days, wait for my parents to get a flight, and as soon as we got the message that they'd landed, we rowed in really quickly. I was so excited, I forgot to stop rowing, and I crashed the boat really loudly against the harbour wall, convincing everybody that we were still as clueless at the end of the journey as we had been at the beginning. It certainly hadn't been the straight line journey that we had hoped for, and the storms had really played havoc with our sort of route planning. We couldn't row out of any weather front that was coming our way. And in the worst storm, we'd been blown back in 4 hours, what had previously taken us 30 hours to row. So it'd been quite a tough time. And in total, it had taken 77 days, 7 hours, and 37 minutes. But for me, the success of our campaign was not that we had rowed across the Atlantic. The success of our campaign had been that we had raised £190,000 for metabolic research at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And it was essentially down to these 5 people in this picture that welcomed us at Gatwick Airport on our return. Mia and Henry were patients that I'd looked after for years. And when we started telling people we were going to row across the Atlantic, everybody said, you're stupid, you're crazy, you're never going to do it, you're going to die. And it was actually very few people that sort of got behind us and really supported us. But 2 of those people are Lucy and Joe, parents of the patients. And even though they had an extremely challenging, stressful situation in their day-to-day life, they genuinely believed in us and they went out of their way to support our campaign. So much so that when our sponsor pulled out 3 months before the start of the race, because his marketing team advised them that they didn't really want their company logo associated with 2 dead nurses in the Atlantic, it was Mia's godfather, Jamie, that stepped in and sponsored the campaign for us. So while we may have physically done the rowing, it was actually these 5 that had actually made it all possible. And that money went towards Dr. Emma Footit, a metabolic consultant at Great Ormond Street Hospital, to take 3 years out of her clinical duties to really study the value of vitamin B6 in managing neonatal seizures. And through Emma's work and the funding from that, we went on to, with collaboration from the School of Pharmacy, develop a new formulation that would be more suitable for neonates to tolerate at the time of seizures. And to be there and get the orphan designation and then subsequent protocol assistance, and now get funding to run this study is something that I could never have comprehended at the beginning of the row that it would have led to. On a personal level, I realized I was absolutely addicted to life on the ocean. So when I got a phone call from an angel to say, would you like to be part of the first all-female crew to ever row across the Indian Ocean? I jumped at the chance. I resigned from my job, persuaded my rugby coach to sponsor me, and flew out to Australia to meet 3 girls I'd never met before. They'd been busy for a good year putting the campaign together, and unfortunately for them, but luckily for me, one of the girls had dropped out last minute, which allowed me the opportunity to join them. And we were rowing from Australia to Mauritius, which was 1,000 miles longer than the Atlantic. It was actually far harder in terms of the elements and the weather because we weren't going with the currents and the trade wind this time. And from a physical, environmental point of view, it was a genuinely brutal experience. 10 boats started. We were the only female crew. And within the first 4 weeks, 5 boats had to be rescued. But on the other hand, because there were 4 of us, because we were so committed to doing it, the team spirit was phenomenal. And it just felt like a joy to be out there. And I'm pleased to say we finished second as well. And our world record as the fastest female crew still holds till today. Being Welsh, I always wanted a hat trick. And I looked towards the Pacific Ocean and started putting a campaign together to row across the Pacific, but realized that actually it would take me 7 months to do it, and there was a very good reason why people don't row across the Pacific. So I decided that I would learn how to sail. I'd spent all that time at sea, but had never sailed once. So it's quite a steep learning curve, and I was really fortunate to join the Clip Around the World campaign, which was founded by Sir Robin Knox-Johnson, the first person to sail non-stop around the world. And I flew out to Qingdao and was joining the leg from China to San Francisco. It was decided that they would do a TV documentary about me and that they would put a cameraman on the boat to follow my every single move. And I was a little bit apprehensive, thinking, oh, it's going to be really awkward. He's going to want to see me crying or fighting with the other crewmates all the time. But I needn't have worried. He was so seasick for the first 3 weeks, he didn't film anything. So all the footage came from the last 4 days where he was frantically panicking how to do it. And through sailing, I realized that it was actually easier to combine time offshore with day-to-day life without the destruction. And with sailing, I also got to meet my husband, Chris Frost. And we recently completed a 2-handed sailing race across the same routes that I'd rowed in. So while it had taken me 17 days to row it, it only took me 19 days to sail it. So quite a bit different. So what does crossing all these oceans mean to me now? I can only describe it as being the most life-changing experience. Yes, it was the best thing, but also it was the worst thing. But it has also given me the confidence to look at my professional career in a different way. I went on to complete my own PhD at UCL, and I had the courage to apply to work at the European Medicine Agency to be part of the first paediatric team to implement the paediatric regulation in Europe. And I worked as a regulator at the EMA for 6 years, evaluating over 100 PIPs and protocol assistants, I can't say the word today, can I? Which was just a great follow-on what had been my clinical experience. As a children's nurse, I'd started to look after children recruited into clinical trials. And very early on, I got to read inclusion criteria that said child is able to swallow tablets and child is able to comply with study assessments. Now, anybody that has children knows that this is actually not what children do. And this is Mia that you saw before. And Mia was one of the patients that was recruited into a particularly challenging clinical trial where they were frequently brought in for numerous tests and assessments. And it used to break my heart every month that they'd come up. She'd have all these tests, and then when they were leaving, Joe would say to Mia, "Say thank you to Elin." And I was like, why would a 4-year-old girl want to thank me for inflicting so much pain on her? But this was the sort of primary endpoint for that study that Mia was taking part in. And you can imagine to try and get a 4-year-old child to comply with such an assessment was really traumatic. But because they were facing a really progressive disease, the families felt that they had no choice but to try and go through the clinical trial. Sadly, that trial ended up with inconclusive data, which I think is a reflection of many pediatric trials that have such complex endpoints. And so my PhD was specifically looking at, could we develop outcome measures that were more friendly for children? But also parents used to always tell me, why are we using this endpoint in this clinical trial when it has no relevance at all to what I'm struggling with on my day-to-day basis? It doesn't even make sense. And one of the assessments that we looked at was the gait analysis and some others that was more to do with the patient's activity of daily living and more aligned with the patient-reported outcomes kind of things. And a combination of my PhD, my clinical experience, and then later on as a regulator made me really think it's all about the quality of the data and the quantity of the data in a different way, where I thought emerging technology could really help us address this challenge that for me was very basic, in the fact that all the tests that we do rely on very snapshot episodic data during hospital visits. And again, the parents would tell me, he's not performing very well today because he's missing his drama class, which has made him in a really bad mood today, so he's not going to comply with any test. Or they won't do the test you want today because I wouldn't let them buy ice cream at the train station on the way to the hospital. And that always influenced how the data was captured on the study day. And I was very interested in what's happening in between, what's happening at home, what does the patient experience look like from their point of view. And that's with the advent of emerging technology, I founded Aparito, which is incorporating a wearable device that fits the need of the disease, fits the need of the age of the patient, incorporating it with a bring your own device approach on the patient or parent's phone, and making the data available to clinicians. So far, we've deployed studies here in the UK, in India and America, and we've got 2 studies about to start in South Africa and in Germany too. And when I was invited to be part of today's conference, which was obviously very exciting for me, it made me think of this blog that I'd seen where it was talking about software-enabled clinical trials, and I was slightly thrilled to see Aparito up there with Medidata, so maybe it's a sign that we can collaborate for the future. So for me, I can honestly say that this combination of my personal and professional experiences has really enriched my life, from having my books published, having an invitation to go to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen, and having the opportunity to not only carry the Olympic torch, but quite recently the Commonwealth torch as well. But most importantly, that I have raised quite a lot of money for charities and research close to my heart, which is all down to the support that I've had from families and friends, and indeed strangers, that kind of genuinely get behind my adventures to date. And it's basically all down to Mia and Henry and patients like Mia and Henry that just taught me so much about determination and resilience. I sort of have the luxury of choosing to put myself through these adventures, and I'm forever thankful for it. But for patients like Mia and Henry, they don't necessarily have a choice of what they have to face, but yet they do it with such bravery and courage. It always blows me away. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a really big honor for me to be here, and thank you for letting me share my story.